My name's Elizabeth Buchan. I'm a research intern here at Aussie, and today I'm joined by Ash Collingberg. Ash is a visiting fellow here at Aussie's Counter-Terrorism Policy Centre. And today we're going to discuss the Australian Army's role in building partner capacity through training missions. So Ash, you recently published in The Strategist that Australia has a very good reputation for its training missions. What do you think it is about Australia's approach that produces these successful outcomes?
Well, when Australian soldiers join up, they sign a contract with the nation, and it's based on 4 Army values: courage, initiative, respect, and teamwork. So I'll just go through each of those briefly because each relates directly to how we behave as soldiers, both here in Australia and overseas. So courage is about physical and moral courage. And it's really about doing the right thing. So serving in the best interests of the nation and of the army. Initiative is seeking out opportunities and embracing innovation. Respect is respect for yourself, for your colleagues, for our communities, and for those forces that we partner with overseas. And teamwork is really supporting each other. So supporting your own team, supporting communities here in Australia, supporting our allies, and again, supporting those forces that we're working with overseas. So those 4 values are really the bedrock or the cultural and ethical foundation for the way that we behave as soldiers. And I think that puts us in good stead for the way we act and the way we serve, whether it be a conventional mission or a training mission. When you combine that with just professionalism, I think our training establishments in the Army are very good. They produce highly professional officers and soldiers, and that goes a long way towards achieving the mission overseas. When we get overseas, we spend a lot of time building rapport. I think we recognise as professional soldiers that relationships are important at every level. And it really doesn't matter whether you're here in Australia or whether you're serving overseas, relationships matter. Our soldiers are understanding that Iraqis are different. They have a different culture, they speak a different language, so therefore we need to adapt to suit that situation and suit those circumstances. So we invest a lot of time up front to ensure that we get to know our training audience, allow them to get to know us so that we feel comfortable with each other, and then we can really get down to the serious business of training.
Sure. And so on that training aspect, you talk about the value of training missions as being a force multiplier.
Yeah.
So in what ways are you able to improve and amplify the capacities of local forces?
If I could sum it up in one word, I'd say confidence.
Right.
So what we do is we have a training audience, and it's normally a battalion or a brigade, and we have that unit for 6 to 8 weeks, and we go through a very graduated training progression from individual training, where we'll take each individual soldier, we'll run them through weapon drills, we'll take them to the range to live fire, and we'll improve their shooting out of sight. So some of the soldiers won't hit the target initially. We'll bring them on so that they achieving first round hits on target first time, almost every time. And then we'll do sort of individual first aid training, explosive hazard awareness training, and then we'll progress. So we'll move into collective training at squad, platoon, company level. And what we're really focused on there is getting the Iraqis to work as a team, not just as infantrymen, but as combined arms teams. So to incorporate all of their other assets they have, their artillery, their armour, their aviation, their logistics, and their engineers, all as one fighting unit. So that's something that they are not particularly good at. So we spend a lot of time focusing on that. So confidence, at the end of the day, we produce, or our training produces Iraqi units that are confident in their equipment, confident in their tactics, and confident in their team.
Sure. And are there any aspects of the training that present particular challenges, or where you feel maybe outcomes aren't being met?
Yeah, so I think that probably the two biggest challenges are time and training resources. So obviously the longer you have the force for, the better the output at the back end. As I said, we have them typically for 6 to 8 weeks, so there's only so much we can achieve in that time frame. But as they drive out the gate at the end of that 6 to 8 weeks, they're a far more capable organisation than they were on day one. So that's important. As far as training resources go, we must remember that Iraq's at war, so they're fighting a war whilst also sending units in to the bases to train with us. The good thing is that the Iraqi senior officers recognise the value of the training, so they really do want to push their units back through Taji, for example, to train, and they recognise that after that training they are actually a better organisation for it. In fact, one of the generals in Iraq, the Baghdad operations commander, he took online units offline to send them into training because he recognised that they would be better for it. And he also asked us to conduct a junior leaders course for his soldiers because he recognised that our non-commissioned officers are strong and they're a real strength in our army. So he wanted more of that in the Iraqi army. So we started conducting junior leaders courses for the Iraqi army, and that's been really effective. One of the limitations at Taji is it's quite a small base, so it's only a 6 by 6 square kilometre base. So there's not a lot of high level live fire training we can do. We can't fire artillery or tanks or drop bombs from the air. So that's all done at a different base, southeast of Baghdad at Besmaya. So the good thing there is, though, the Prime Minister announced in July that we're going to slightly expand our training mission to include training Iraqi police, and we're also going to allow our trainers some flexibility so that they could actually train on other bases other than Taji.
Oh,
so
great.
I think they're our biggest limitations, but we work around those and do the best we can.
Moving more specifically to strategy, the impending attack on Mosul is seen by many as the final frontier in the fight against Daesh. Post-Mosul, does the strategy shift from a degrading approach to one of containment? Or how does it change?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to note is Mosul will be a really hard fight. I think the Iraqi security forces have done a really good job to date in taking back Anbar, and they fought really well in Ramadi and Fallujah, and they've had great success there. I think Mosul will be in many ways harder because the enemy's had more time to prepare. I have no doubt that the Iraqi security forces will prevail and they will take back Mosul. And there'll be pockets of resistance, no doubt, and then the remainder of the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh as I'll refer to them, they'll fall back on their capital of Raqqa. But I think in many ways the hardest part for the Iraqis will actually be shoring up the peace. So once they actually take back that territory or that city, is to ensure law and order, and domestic security is a policing function. So it's really important now that we look to the future and we start focusing on how the Iraqi government is going to maintain peace and security once the enemy is militarily defeated.
And will that be part of you mentioned we're going to be a bit more involved in the policing aspect. Will that sort of approach be part of that training or part of a consideration?
Yeah, so as I said, Prime Minister Turnbull, he announced in July that we would slightly increase our mandate or expand our mandate, I guess, to include training the Iraqi police. So I think that's really smart decision.
Yeah.
That's looking longer term, and it's recognising that actually the law and order, that's a policing function, and that's what's going to be important in the long term in Iraq.
Terrorism has increasingly global implications and consequences. Are local capacities alone going to be sufficient to tackle this threat of potentially transnational terrorist networks?
So I think the Australian intelligence community, together with our law enforcement agencies, both at the federal, state and territory levels, are doing a good job. They're really stretched. They only have so much capacity and they have finite resources. But I think they are really doing a good job. Our national terror threat level has been at high. An attack is probable for 2 years now, and I think that's right. That's where it should be. And we just saw last weekend with the Minto stabbing that a terrorist attack can occur anywhere, anytime, and people will become radicalised and they will act on their own. And these so-called lone actors can conduct really unsophisticated attacks relatively easy. So what does that mean? It means that we should not live in fear. We should not change our lifestyle. We are the lucky country, so we need to work together with our communities, and particularly those sort of at-risk or vulnerable communities. So our minority groups, we don't want to marginalise them. We want to bring them into the table and work with them to ensure that together we are a resilient nation and that we protect our population and we secure our borders. Now, I think part of that is actually a layered approach. So we fight Daesh in their so-called caliphate in the Middle East, and we defeat them militarily there. If we don't do that, I fear that that region will become a long-term breeding ground for terrorism. So that's important. But we also know that Daesh have expanded their operations into Southeast Asia now. Yeah. So we need to ensure that we partner with our neighbours to protect the region. And it's a whole of government approach. So it's not just something that the military can achieve or that the Australian Federal Police can do. It's all of those arms working together in concert to achieve an effect. And then, of course, back home in Australia, as I said, it's not just something that we can rely on the government or the law enforcement agencies to achieve. As communities, we all need to work together.
Sure. And then I guess on the ground, or more in the Southeast Asian region around Iraq, have you seen much cooperation between those local forces in trying to stem this sort of cross-border terrorism?
So Iraq is a very complex situation, obviously, because Daesh crosses borders. Their so-called caliphate covers parts of Iraq and Syria. Yeah. The border is porous. They are operating on interior lines, which means they can operate fairly freely between those two countries. There are so many different armed groups within both Syria and Iraq today that it just adds additional layers of complexity. And then you have state actors like Iran and Russia and Saudi Arabia, who have their own national interests, who are playing a part. So I think more needs to be done internationally to ensure that at the grand strategic level, there is a plan that encompasses the whole region.
Sure. Your article refers to Australia's involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, but you've also been involved in UN missions in very different contexts, so in East Timor, in Lebanon, Sudan, and each of those mandates had elements of nation building and security sector development. Are there any sweeping observations to be made about what makes for a successful approach to developing local capacity?
Yes, so I would say that Indigenous security capacity is key. Yeah. That is not always going to be present, so you need to build that. And I think that what we're doing in Iraq now with the Building Partner Capacity mission is a good example of how that might look. But security alone is not enough. So in South Sudan today, for example, the Regional Protection Force is, in my mind, it's a band-aid solution. It is not a long-term, enduring solution. All it's doing really is it's treating the symptoms. Yeah. the insecurity, it's the symptoms really. The cause of the problem requires a political response.
Yeah.
And the problem in these conflict zones is that we, too often I think, we use our military instrument of national power to try and solve the problem. But very rarely does that work, because military victory, I think, rarely results in strategic success. So it needs to be a whole of government approach. Security is absolutely critical to ensure that all of the other parts of government are functioning. But at the end of the day, you need to address the core grievances of the population. So for example, in Iraq today, you have Daesh is the symptom, but the real problem is the sectarian divide that is really, that's caused a civil war,
Yeah.
which Daesh has, it has exploited that sectarian divide to create their own violence, and they thrive in that sort of situation, which is why they crossed over into Syria in the first place.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Ash, and thank you for listening.
My pleasure.